So Navalny is kind of he was the son of a factory operator from sort of the Belarus, Ukraine, Russian region, who grew up as became a lawyer in the late 90s. So he came into Russian economics and politics at the peak of when everybody was using the new Russian system to rip off the Russian people. So a lot of these guys were engaged in legally questionable behavior. If you grew up during that sort of chaotic time period when Russia's almost entire economy collapsed, culture collapsed, crime exploded. Its military was busy selling nuclear submarines to to Colombian drug cartels. The you had multiple wars and conflicts in Chechnya and other parts of the country. You had basically the entire country kind of collapsed. And if you were a young professional during that time frame, you saw politics as a money making opportunity. And so it appears, and a lot of them engaged in what was called entrepreneurial behavior, that often was what would be called by most people tax evasion, embezzlement, bribery, thievery of all kinds. But it was kind of ordinary course at the time. If you were in the 90s, that's how you made your money. That's how a certain Konstantin Kissin's father apparently made a lot of money himself. I think he now denies that he was the mini oligarch and one of the first people to really capitalize on that version of Russia, but that at least was the story at the time. So that was the world that Navalny was introduced into. Politics as a tool to get rich, to be a full scale, wholesale approved grifter. Often connected to the new oligarchs, connected to Russian organized crime, connected to corrupt government actors, connected to Western think tanks, all kind of complicit. From there, in the early 2000s, Putin begins to stabilize the country. That's the real source of his popularity. It's not, dictatorship or anything we like to pretend in the West. He's legitimately the most popular leader over the last quarter century because of what the outcomes occurred under his governance. Radical reduction in poverty, radical reduction in crime, radical improvement in self-confidence in the military being stabilized and their security being stabilized and getting peace deals so they're not under constant threat of terrorism or global conflict in Chechnya and elsewhere. And so that leads to the next stage. How do you now make money in politics? And if you weren't going to be part of the Putin regime, and Navalny first flirted with both sides of the extremes that were the most popular alternatives to Putin. Those were the ultra nationalists in Russia, often would be labeled far right, very anti-immigrant, frequently, opposed to various forms of immigration, very often, more radical on issues of Chechnya, often blended into sort of anti-Islamic belief structures. The often had racial undertones or sometimes overt. And then on the other side of the lead opposition to Putin was the communists. I mean, there was a resurgence of the Communist Party's popularity, especially in the late 90s, because of the collapse. You had 40% of seniors in poverty. You had homelessness. You had crime. You had alcoholism. I mean, you had problems that many ordinary Russians had not experienced at that scale. And so, there's a lot of criticisms of the communist regime, but one of them wasn't that crime was rampant. For example, it was hard to commit crime because everybody knew if you did it, because everybody was equally broke, and so forth. The criminals were the bureaucrats, the actual government employees. Those were the criminals. But that changed in the 90s. And he flirted with them too, Navalny. Then, the internet came to age, and Navalny tapped that and became one of the first online bloggers and used YouTube channels and ran for the mayor of Moscow. Got a little bit of support and popularity. But basically, he was kind of like a Lyndon LaRouche type figure, except not politically consistent. Very Russian in the during this time frame, and that their politics changed depending on the week, the month, the day, or the year. But he was all over the place until after he has a little bit of surprise success as a blogger turned Moscow mayoral candidate, and Moscow has its own Moscow Mafia, as it's called, not really organized crime as it is a political machine that's actually independent of and separate from Putin. These people were connected to Hunter Biden and other people, for example. They have their own corrupt regime there. He all of a sudden gets an invite to a new institute set up at Yale University, the Yale World Fellows Program. The Yale World Fellows Program was being run by the wife of Strobe Talbot. This was, in fact, it was based entirely on the Clintons' World Fellows Program that they had established while they were in the White House. And they use Yale to establish it, and they invite a lot of people, supposedly, to promote global peace and prosperity and what have you. They would tend to show up with deep state aligned groups all around the world, whether Venezuela, Colombia, Africa, Asia. And the big one they picked from Russia was Navalny, of all people. And that's from that point forward, all of a sudden his politics changed. He went from being, uber right-wing and ultra-nationalist, and it was time to take back Belarus and Ukraine and everything else in the Russian Empire, to being opposed to any conflict in Ukraine. He went from being, ultra right-wing on his cultural viewpoints to saying we needed to support gay marriage. And he was personally a big supporter of BLM, which I can tell you does not have huge support in Russia. And he became kind of the fake candidate of the West. The West pretended he was the big pot. The reason why I have Taylor of Panama behind me is it's like the silent opposition portrayed in Taylor of Panama, or the secret organization in Our Man in Havana by Graham Greene, both a book and a film. It was completely fake by the West. Navalny never had more than 2% support at his peak in Russia. There was no mass support for Navalny. He was not a mass leader. Nobody cared about him in Russia. Putin didn't care about him until he showed up as a Yale Global Fellow. And then he was like, what's going on here? What are they trying to use this fellow for? What's he up to? His campaign manager was caught on tape trying to pitch the West, hey, give us $20 million and we'll overthrow the government for you. Now, what happened is he had always been involved in embezzlement schemes. He, his brother, other people. But most of those schemes were not criminally prosecuted very aggressively. What happened, in fact, but after he shows up as a Yale fellow, all of a sudden the Russian government has a little more interest in him. And they do prosecute him for those old embezzlement schemes. I mean, he had like a half dozen ones. Every time he turned around, he was involved in some new embezzlement scheme. But that's how you made money in Russia during that time frame. Grifting was a way of life. It was a professional occupational path. Navalny called it just good entrepreneurial work. That's how they defined it there in Russia. It's kind of like what the Africans learned from colonial government, that bribery was just the way of, that's what good government equaled, because they witnessed it in live time. So, but he was put on probation, suspended sentences, but he kept getting into trouble over and over again. Now, the other thing he did is he used his new YouTube channel. So he was one of the first people in Russia to, for being an online blogger, also one of the first people to use YouTube in a particularly effective
Apparently,
manner.
He had 6 million followers at one point on his channel.
Oh, exactly. Boosted big. Now, part of that was because he was a Western-backed guy. The West was backing him to support him with this idea that he would be the next president. They really convinced themselves. I think some were the smarter ones knew they were lying. Your Kissingers of the world knew this guy was an unpopular version of Lyndon LaRouche. But the delusional ones convinced themselves that, it's like in Taylor of Panama, where the general says, gentlemen, there's a star missing from our flag. Talking about, waging war on Panama to add star number 51. There were some people like that in the West that really convinced your Condoleezza Rices of the world, some others, convinced themselves he was this deeply popular leader. He never had any popularity ever in Russia. But he had globals. A lot of the 6 million weren't Russians. But what he did a good job of was, in his grifter space, he became a guy who you could pay him to rat out your enemies. So if you had an enemy within the government or an enemy within the Russian economic structure, you would go to Navalny, feed him a bunch of dirt about your opponent, and rat him out. Now, he got into trouble for this because he did no due diligence on any investigation he reported. So he got successfully sued for defamation, for libel, for other conspiracies, because he couldn't back up what he claimed. But he developed this sort of gadfly, ne'er-do-well, protest outsider challenger within particularly the younger population within Russia that was big in social media kind of liked him, but that was the extent of it. He had no popular appeal beyond it. And then once he was like doing pro BLM stuff, pro gay marriage stuff, pro Ukraine stuff, he lost all appeal entirely. So, but the West convinced themselves that they could stage a coup, that they would overthrow Putin, and they would put Navalny in. And so he goes through this very peculiar thing where he's on a plane and supposedly he's poisoned, and so he has to go to Germany to get treatment.
Poisoned with, like they said, Soviet era radioactive material.
Yeah, they keep saying it's this incredibly powerful poison that manages to never kill anyone. Right. So it's like if Putin wanted you dead, yeah, you'd be dead.
Well, we saw it with Poroshenko. I mean, it'll happen if Putin wants it.
Oh yeah, of course. So Putin only cared about this guy to the degree he was a nuisance tied to the West that the West wanted to utilize him for. Beyond that, he was very insignificant in Putin's world, and in the ordinary Russian could care less about him. But so he uses this to generate lots of coverage in the West. He goes to Germany. Oh my God, the Putin tried to kill him. He's the next great leader. And remember, this is when all the West media was saying Putin's about to be overthrown. Putin's has health problems. But, Ukraine is a disaster. So they really had convinced themselves. Some people in the West, like Taylor of Panama, really convinced themselves Navalny was the next president of Russia. There was zero chance of that ever occurring. Zero. So he stages his little event. They claim that Putin poisoned him. But they won't allow an independent. Russia's like, let's do an independent investigation. Let's have multiple countries involved and see what happened. Oh no, Germany. We can't do that, Germany. Because it's all fake. So dude goes back to Russia now, but of course because he fled to Germany and staged this whole nonsense, he's violated
terms of parole or something.
Yeah, he again. This guy was given like 3 suspended sentences. Right? I mean, he got convicted again and again and again and again for multiple crimes. And the Western excuse was always, oh, this is politically motivated, etc. They couldn't factually disprove any of the claims. It was quite clear the guy did commit the bribery and embezzlement. Again, his defense is, hey, everybody was doing it in Russia. That's how you made your money. But so he goes back, and now because Putin sees they're trying to use Navalny to stage a coup, he's like, okay, maybe it's time that our Russian justice system apply a little bit of old school justice. And so they sentence him to prison.
So let me stop you there. Why does he go back? Does he go back thinking that he actually stands a political chance of...
The West, he's convinced one, he's doing his job. This is his new line of money is. He was already in trouble because he had already grifted a bunch of money from his parties in Russia that apparently stole a lot of money from his donors and contributors. Again, that's what the guy did. That's what he was. He was, a grifter on steroids. Not a half bad one, But the new deal with the West was he needed to go back so they could stage a coup. I don't know whether he ever really believed. He might have been delusional enough to think he was the next president of Russia. You got the CIA behind you. You got the MI6 behind you. You got German intelligence behind you. They're telling you you're going to be a hero. CNN saying you're going to be the next thing. Da, da, da. So maybe he really believed it. And that's where, Putin was just a reminder to everybody, well, maybe it's time for a little Russian justice. See how you like those winters in Siberia. Next time you think the CIA is going to run our country. And so that's what happened. While he was in jail, he got his health deteriorated. Now, I find the timing of his death doesn't benefit Russia. The timing of his death benefits the West. That's where a lot of people there was one person who said, I didn't think the CIA took him out until Biden made a big deal about being taken out.
Robert, I was watching Biden's presser, and the thought hadn't entered my head, and I felt stupid. But then he's like, now's the time. Literally, people, history is watching, and now let me milk it.
They can't get a vote. They can't get Ukrainian money passed. They can't get the Patriot Act restored. And first they say Putin's got space nukes. He's going to put nukes up in space. That was their first line of excuse. And now the new one is, oh, look, he killed the great Navalny, the great civil rights leader. This is literally our man in Havana, Taylor of Panama, written to life. And the number of people who buy it is extraordinary. Amnesty International got in trouble last year when they were promoting him. And people are like, well, let me give you some of Navalny's quotes over the years. It's him referring to certain groups as cockroaches who need to be stepped on. And Amnesty was like, we missed that one part of the memorandum. The guy's a complete fake. He makes us look like such a joke. To the Russian audience, That's like, we never liked. This would literally be like saying Lyndon LaRouche was the most popular man in America and been stolen his ability to be president. And Americans would be like, what in the heck are you talking about?
I don't know how many Americans would know who. I Googled who Lyndon LaRouche was in the meantime, but I'll say analogously might be Kamala Harris, told she's going to be the president and has it stolen from her. So not off the table in terms of thought experiments that intelligence said he's more useful dead than alive at this point.
Oh, yes. Yes. Huh. And can you imagine this administration and the people that are the people who are wanting more money to go to Ukraine, which actually did kill someone for pure speech grounds? I mean, and not only that, an American citizen. Navalny was never an American citizen. Gonzalo Lira was. Gonzalo Lira, there was no allegations of corruption involving Gonzalo Lira.